Shall we start?
Yes, Ina, let's go ahead.
Okay. So may I welcome all colleagues to this day where we are launching a publication on the recent trends and patterns on sex ratio at birth in India. A piece of wonderful research work done by Professor Kulkarni. UNFPA has over the years been working on the issue of sex ratio at birth and on gender biased sex selection through an engagement with a multiplicity of stakeholders, with demographers, policymakers, with communicators, with feminists, with the women's movement, with the health sector, with the medical professionals. And at the forefront of the work, the very foundation of our work has been to have solid data on what is happening with regard to sex determination. This dissemination is in the spirit of expanding our collective understanding on responding to this issue. Let me have the privilege of introducing those of us who are our speakers. The chairperson for this meeting is Matabel, the representative for UNFPA in India and country director for Bhutan. Our guest of honor, Shri Praveen Srivastava, is Secretary, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, known as MOSPI. He is also the Chief Statistician of India. And Shri Srivastava serves as Secretary of the National Statistical Commission as well. And in his able hands rests India's contribution to data and trends on the SDGs. He's been associated with work on the health sector for many, many years. So very, very happy to have him here this morning. The author of this study is Professor Kulkarni. He is a renowned demographer. Most of you know him and he needs no introduction. He is an expert in population studies. He is not a stranger to us. He has formerly been professor at the Center for Study of Regional Development, the School of Social Sciences in Jawaharlal Nehru University. His research interests are technical demography, population policies, reproductive and child health. He has written for many journals, including Population Studies, Demography, EPW, and a number of edited volumes. He has been a technical guide and a go-to expert for UNFPA and many, many other people working on the issue of sex ratio. We're also happy to have with us from a very different time zone, Professor Christophe Guilmoto. He is a senior fellow in demography at the Institut de Recherche pour le Développement, the IRD, which is an institute for research on development based in Paris. He's a senior fellow there, and he teaches at the School of Advanced Studies in the social sciences as well. His research interests are population dynamics, inequalities, historical and spatial socioeconomic perspectives. And over the last decade, he's done an enormous amount of work on gender biased sex selection globally, as well as in India. And he's organized many conferences, many panels on sex determination. And he has also been the guide for UNFPA's recent report on practices, including sex ratio. He's written a book on the demographic transition in China, India, and Indonesia, along with Gavin Jones, that came out in 2016. Now, having introduced the panel, it's my pleasure to hand over to Argentina, our representative in India. Over to you. Argentina, you're muted.
Oh, there you go, technology. So I was saying, now I lost my, what happened now? Oops.
We can hear you, we can see you.
Oh, here. Yes, I was saying thank you very much, Ina, for this introduction, especially of our panelists, the guest of honor and chair. So I will start by really thanking everyone and welcoming all of you, the senior officials in government, the Secretary MOSPI and other senior officials, our research institutions and fellows, our development partners and civil society organization members, but also many colleagues of the UN who have joined, because everyone really is looking forward to learning from this study. Now, Professor Kulkarni, as Ina has said, has always been there whenever we need him to help us and enrich our understanding around many issues on population. And so I want to thank you very, very much, Professor, for doing this study and leading also this dissemination. Professor Gilmotto also has been a strong ally of UNFPA, but also really working hard on helping to generate evidence on this issue of gender bias sex selection, which usually going around social norms, people will tend to overlook or deny unless we have hard evidence. And I wanted to save the best for last, our guest of honor, Sri Praveen Shrivastava, the MOSPI secretary, always plays a very important role because it is the government entity and authority that really looks into these social surveys, economic surveys, that then help to complement the work that is done by the RGI on census. So we're very thankful to you, sir, for accepting to be with us today. Now, the collection of an analysis of demographic research and census data is always a fundamental part of UNFPA's work. Some people see us mostly on the ground, but actually as a UN agency, we're really more of a knowledge agency, especially in a country such as India that has its own economic capacity to do work and has a wealth of NGOs to do the work on the ground. We are there just sometimes to get case studies and collect evidence, but our work is really fundamentally on the production of knowledge. And so this is an engine that drives and propels programming across all our mandates and feeds into the work that we do here in India and other countries, especially around this issue, then feeds in knowledge into work done in other countries that might have a bit lesser capacities for doing this high-level studies in country. Now, the census data is where we first got alerted to something not quite right in the issue of sex selection, of sex ratio. And we started noticing that there was a certain norm that should be, and there was a big deviation from that norm. But census data, or we all know, just the other day, the Secretary of the Ministry of Women and Children was expressing his frustration, the fact that the census data comes every 10 years. So he has to wait 10 years to be able to compare whether, you know, the work that they're doing to address this issue that the country is doing is breeding results or not. And that's why this work that Professor Kulkarni has done today is very important, because he focuses on analyzing different sorts of data so that we could, in intercessory times and help, you know, we have a sense of where we're going. He looks into socioeconomic factors and implications as well, but he also looks at the national and regional data trends. I sincerely hope and know that this work will help our collective understanding on this issue, and appreciate that so many you know, development practitioners out there and researchers have heeded our call to attend this dissemination, but also to put questions that will challenge some of the assumptions or the findings in the study. And last but not least, this report comes very timely. We thank Professor Kulkarni for managing to finish it just as we were launching earlier this month on the 30th of June, the State of the World Population Report 2020, which comes every year, is the flagship report of UNFPA, that every year looks at different issues of interest for the times or around population issues. And this year it focused on harmful practices and looked into 19 types of harmful practices against women and girls, but focused on 3: child marriage, gender bias sex selection, and there was another one that Ina could maybe remind us, female genital mutilation. But for India, we really focused more on child marriage and gender-biased sex selection. So this report or study of Professor Kulkarni will help to complement that report, because the UNFPA Global State of the World Population Report is global and looks at several countries. And so with that, once again, welcome, and without further ado, over to you, Ina, to guide us into the meat of the meeting. Thank you.
So I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome two colleagues from the Ministry of Health. We're really grateful they've made the time to join us. We have Ms. Nivedita Gupta, who's the Chief Director Statistics in the Health Ministry. Welcome, ma'am. And Vidushi Chaturvedi, who's the Director in charge of PCPNDT and looks after all the work with regard to gender-biased sex selection. Very welcome to you as well, Vidushi. Okay. We will move on now to the next highlight of our program, the release of the report. And may I request Mr. Praveen Srivastava and Madam Argentina Matavel to please release the report virtually. This is the first time I'm seeing it happen.
Navigating so how do I open this? Oops, I think I need training. Here we go.
Very nice.
I hope
very
it's
much.
visible.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely visible. Very nice. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am. We will now proceed to a very short video which gives an orientation on the issue of gender-biased sex selection. May we have the video, please? Thank you. May I now request our guest of honor, Mr. Praveen Srivastava, to please say a few words.
Thank you, Ina, and I will say only a few words. So, Argentina, Professor Kulkarni, Professor Christopher, I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience and some in the waiting room, but it's good to be in this forum, and I want to thank UNFPA for accommodating the time to suit my calendar, because I have another meeting immediately after this, and I want to thank you again once for this. Professor Kulkarni is, of course, one of the outstanding demographers in the country. I don't need to say too much on how much he has contributed, and he continues to contribute. That's a big thing. Your report is really wonderful. I had a quick glance of it before this event. And I'm very happy to note that you have been bringing the data forward and making it speak because I think that's what we all need to think about, and how do we make data speak to the larger audience, not only to the research people, but also the people who are going to move and be the influencer in the community. So your study is really useful from that point of view, but it also highlights the issue of data shortages. And I would like to speak I'm going to take a bit of time on that. The data shortage is there because people feel that data is free, but data is not free. Data requires they talk about data being new oil, but I take the same analogy and say that for data to be oil, you have to extract, process, purify it before it becomes usable. Same thing with the data. And even though we presume data is free, but there's a huge machinery behind collecting and disseminating that information across to the various users. People do understand the limitations of it. Mostly people don't. And it's these data gaps that actually fuels research. And which is why this research community, which is sitting ahead of us, is pouring their minds and their, exploiting their gray matter to the extent that they can make meaning out of what are the gaps and how we can fill them up. But this issue of the quality and the coverage of data is so important. We do have parallel systems, we do have multiple systems, just to ensure that we don't leave anyone behind, which is the guiding principle for the Sustainable Development Goals. And I believe the study is going to help us a lot in that direction, because we need to understand the data gaps from a perspective of how can we improve it within the existing framework, and how can we augment it by filling up that information system. In fact, if you look at it from a theoretical point of view, ideally you should have some database which talks about from the prenatal care, antenatal care, to the birth, to the education, identification, and then their employment, skilling, social security benefit. If you have this cross-cutting chain, it ensures that no one is left behind. But in this process, you also have activists which talks about data privacy. And in this debate between data privacy and need for data for policy, where do you draw a line? How do you ensure systems are in place that provides the data required for policy, at the same time not compromising the integrity of the database or the privacy of the individual? So these are issues that we need to also discuss, and knowing very well that data does fuel research, but at the same time, it has to be a cyclical effect that the research should also fuel into improving a data system. So it has to be a complete cycle. Coming to the basic issue of sex ratio at birth, it is important, this estimation that has come out, Professor Kulkarni has come out with certain estimates. I believe it's a good idea of, giving a sense of levels. What would have happened if all our policies were correct, if the society was responsible, and would those missing children, girls, be missing, or would they be, thriving and getting empowered? Needless to say that the government tries its best. We are talking about those campaigns of Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. All those things are in the pipeline, and it's having impact of having an influence on the social behavior. But the challenge is that we have to approach it in a multi-pronged activity. It cannot be just one single short solution. And I think this forum can actually debate on that. How do we change the behavior of society? Through IEC advocacy is one, but at the same time, initiatives from the government. Recently, you heard about the announcement of Permanent Commission of Women in the Armed Forces. A sense of empowerment, a sense of responsibility, sense of belongingness has to come in within the society, and we need to get in the stakeholders. We also need to talk to the film industry as well. The way they glorify certain activities which should not be glorified is something that we need to promote to ensure that there is actual gender empowerment. When we talk about the big fat Indian wedding, we glorify it, and at the same time, you find that there's a threshold for a woman to have a girl child and get to her married. They know there's a financial liability on them. Whereas it should not be a liability, it should basically be an asset. And how do you change that mindset is something that we need to also focus on. How do we bring the opinion makers, opinion leaders in a platform that they can understand that for sensationalism, you can do a lot of things. A lot of things glorify activities, but then how do you neutralize that? What sort of policy do you need? What sort of advocacy do we need? I think that we need to discuss. Because this number that is coming out in terms of missing child is something which is a matter of concern. We should approach it objectively, not defensively, but to see how it can gel into the program when we go and drill down into the data, find out where the problems are. Can we promote, through community radio, community participation in improving this gender bias? And fortunately, COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to explore this more holistically. Even in fact, the forum that you're having today, a virtual platform, and we talk about the dais and the delegate, but basically it's all coming on the same platform. This leveraging of technology is actually a game changer. And this game changer does make it happen. I can tell you in my own office, there are women who were on maternity leave and also childcare leave. But looking at this power of the virtual platform, they have rejoined office. They are working from home. We are encouraging that they work from home. They also feel empowered that they are participating, not sitting idle at home. And these are small steps, but they make a difference. Technology is a leveler in society. We should see how we can use that to bridge the gaps and improve the societal behavior. So these are small things that I thought that I should share with you, but I want to compliment Professor Kulkarni for his continued effort in bringing out these insights into improvement of our programs and policies. Thank you so much.
Ina, you're on mute.
Ina, you are please unmute. Ina, please unmute.
Still on mute, Ina.
Okay, for the third time, I'll try. Thank you so much, Mr. Srivastav, for those words and that guidance that you have provided us with regard to the future, the important points you make about data availability, data cost, and data privacy, as well as what you have pointed out to us with regard to the importance of what's happening with these trends, the significance of these findings, and what program implications they have. I'm going to now invite Professor Kulkarni to please speak to present to us the findings of the report in summary. Many of you have asked whether the report will be available in soft copy, and yes, it will. We'll try to put a link into the chat box so that you can access it in the meeting itself, but it will also be available through our website, and you can all write to us. Please, you're all muted, all participants are muted. Please do write your questions in the chat box, and later in the session, we will be taking a response to those from our panelists. Professor Kulkarni, over to you. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Ina, and my thanks to Argentina and Praveen Srivastava for the introductory remarks and also very kind words. At the outset, I am very grateful to the UNFPA for this opportunity to prepare this report and the excellent job they have done in bringing out the report and releasing this report for this dissemination. Someone coming from university background, we are not used to this. We write a paper and struggle to get it published in some journal or the other for some time, and often we are not successful. So this is really wonderful to see that the report is being released and it is being disseminated so well. I'm grateful. Actually, I started working on this topic in 2007 when Naseem Tumkaiya was the country representative of UNFPA. That was my first work done at the time, and this has continued. Now, of course, why this topic? This is something that really does not require justification. Everybody knows what is it. Essentially, the sex ratio has been more masculine than natural level for past 30 to 40 years in India and in many other countries as well. We also know why it is so. There is a sonographic scan and termination of pregnancy after a sonographic scan. And that has adversely affected the sex ratio at birth. Fertility squeeze is something, the context which provides, and that has made this kind of tendency fairly common. We have seen the estimates of sex ratio at birth as measured in India. Female births per 1,000 male births have been close to 900 rather than 950 for many years, and this has persisted. And this is so in spite of legal measures to prevent prenatal sex detection, the PCPNDT Act, and the campaigns that have been there. So this is something that is really worrying, why it has persisted so much, whereas country like Korea successfully overcame this problem within a decade. Now, what does the report cover? First of all, there are various sources of data on sex ratio at birth. They do not always agree. And we need to have an assessment of these to arrive at the most plausible estimate of sex ratio at birth. What is really sex ratio at birth in India or in many parts of the country? Following that, we would like to estimate missing female births. That is basically gender bias sex selection. How many female births did not take place precisely because of this kind of practice? Further, we'd also like to see how many girls are missing, how many of them because of prenatal discrimination, that is gender bias sex selection, or postnatal discrimination, which is excess female mortality. Incidentally, in the debate on sex imbalances, it was the postnatal discrimination, excess female mortality, that was considered the major factor. Amartya Sen's work is really on that. That was done long back in 1990. But now we are talking of both pre and postnatal discrimination. The report also looks at variations in SRB, the sex ratio at birth, by birth order, and sex composition of previous children, because that is what really triggers this kind of sex selection. By regions within India, because there have been regional variations, and by socioeconomic background, does it vary by income, education, and other classes. And finally, briefly, it looks at recent evidence on perceived values of son vis-a-vis daughter. This is essentially based on studies carried out by a number of researchers, both field-based studies as well as large-scale surveys. Next. Now, what are the sources of data? First of all, the civil registration system, the sample registration system, surveys, censuses, and the relatively recent health management information system. Each has its own problems. Civil registration system, many births are not registered. Sample registration system is on the sample basis, so there is sampling error. Surveys are retrospective and sampling, so there are sampling errors as well as recall lapse errors. Census, of course, is there, but census is done only once in 10 years, and therefore we do not get a continuous series from the census. And the health management system is relatively new, and the coverage is yet to be universal. Now, an assessment of these data sources is basically presented in this graph. I hope the colors are identifiable. Essentially, the civil registration estimates are the lowest ones generally, and that is obviously because registration of girls is much less common than the registration of boys after birth. Nothing unexpected. The SRS estimates are generally lower than the estimates from the NFHS Family Health Survey in the past, though they have become close now. The health management system estimates recently are also close to the estimates from the National Family Health Survey, but NFHS or health survey estimates have fluctuations and large sampling errors. An assessment of all of these and the indirect estimate from the census, which is obtained by reverse surviving the child sex ratio, the ratio in ages 0 to 6 to birth, the demographic techniques, technique of indirect estimation, it is seen that that is probably the most plausible estimate of sex ratio at birth, the indirect estimate based on the census. However, that is available only once in 10 years. We had it after 2011, we will have it after 2021, and that refers to a wide period of 7 years rather than an annual series. But after comparing that with the SRS, it was found that the SRS estimates are lower by about 2%. And that means we need to raise them by 2% to make them equivalent to the most plausible estimates. And the bold red line shown there, or line shown there, are really the SRS estimates corrected by this 2% correction factor. And if we accept that, then we can say that for the past 15 or 18 years or so, the sex ratio at birth in India has been in the range 900 to 930 per thousand, 900 to 930 girls per thousand birth. Not as bad as seen in the SRS, yet much lower than the natural level. And there has been no clear trend. It has more or less been fluctuating more or less within the band without really any clear trend. No improvement per se. Next. There are, of course, regional variations in sex ratio at birth. This is something that has been known. It is not new. Let me mention here that many of these things we have found similar results even when we did study 10 years ago and so on. There is broad regional pattern. The western and northern states have much lower sex ratio at birth, which means much greater incidence of gender biased sex selection. Haryana, Uttarakhand, Delhi, Gujarat, and so on. Whereas the southern states and especially the eastern states have ratios close to the normal level, not exactly equal. Some have, in fact, about the normal level, especially eastern, northeastern states, Kerala, and so on, have normal level. So we see that there is negligible gender biased sex selection in these states, whereas there is substantial in these states. Now, there have been some changes. There have been some changes, especially Himachal Pradesh, Jammu Kashmir, and Punjab have shown some improvement. However, the improvement in Punjab is still not good enough. It's still far, far below the natural level. There is probably some deterioration in Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, but we are not very sure about it because there are always fluctuations in the SRS estimates, and we need to see whether this decline is real or it is only a short-term kind of thing. Next. Next. Now, what does it mean the sex ratio at birth is low? And that means there is so much gender biased sex selection. How much is it? Now we can estimate it. There are very standard demographic procedures for estimating this. This is nothing new, and it has been done many times in the past. And my estimate of annual number of missing female births which are missed because they were females, is about 380,000, or about 400,000 female births are missed every year because of gender biased sex selection. We can also see how many girls are missed because, as I mentioned earlier, in addition to gender biased sex selection, there is excess female mortality, and therefore there is postnatal discrimination, not caused by scan and so on, but caused by what has been happening in the society as a female neglect, not an act of commission, but perhaps an act of commission. And we can see that in a 5-year period, about 1.9 million girls were missed because of gender biased sex selection, prenatal discrimination, and about half of that because of excess female mortality or postnatal discrimination. So this is fairly high, and this is about 5% of all girls of that age. So of girls of age 0 to 4 or below 5, about 5% are missed, about 3% because of gender-biased sex selection, and about 1.5% because of excess female mortality. Substantial number, and that is also something which should concern all of us. Now, my estimate of annual missing female births is a bit lower than that by Bongartz and Gilmotto. They have given estimates for a large number of countries in the world, including India. And the reason my estimate is lower than that, their estimate is about 620,000 per year, whereas mine is about 380,000, is because of the correction applied to the SRS rate that raises the sex ratio at birth. Next. How does it vary across states? Now this graph shows missing girls due to prenatal and postnatal discrimination. And we can see in Haryana, prenatal discrimination dominates, postnatal is also there, as it does in Uttarakhand, Delhi. These are arranged in that order, basically. So for a large number of states, prenatal discrimination dominates. Whereas for many other states, there is not much prenatal and there is postnatal. However, the pattern we see in prenatal discrimination of northern and western states having large prenatal discrimination, we can see all these Haryana, Uttarakhand, Delhi, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, and so on. Now that is not seen in postnatal discrimination. Postnatal discrimination, you can say, varies across north, south, east, and west. Basically, postnatal discrimination is more widely pervasive rather than restricted to certain regions, whereas prenatal is primarily restricted to the western and northern regions. Next. Now, as we know, the sex ratio at birth, and especially gender-biased sex selection, would take place normally not at the first birth, but at the second birth. And especially if the first birth is a female, if the first birth is a daughter, then there would be tendency to go for sex selection at the second. Similarly, if the first two are daughters, there would be a tendency to go for sex selection at the third birth. And this is something which we can see very clearly. At the first birth, the ratio is not exactly natural, but fairly close to that. At the second birth, if first is a male, there is no problem. First is a female, very low sex ratio at birth, huge sex selection. At two daughters is large level of sex selection. So clearly, this is a gender-biased sex selection, and we can see it. Next. Next, please. Now, this has more or less continued, but especially the sex selection after two daughters has become worse over the years. It has become more severe over the years. Besides, though I have not shown the pictures here, this one, sex selection after two daughters of one daughter, is much higher in the western and northern regions compared to the eastern and southern regions. The details are there in the report, but here I have restricted this. Now, what are the differentials by socioeconomic and regional? We're always interested. Does it vary? Does the tendency depend on your income, education, caste, religion, whatnot, rural, urban? Well, at first birth, now this is done. I tried to first get gross differences and then obtain net differences using logistic regression analysis, because many of the socioeconomic factors are associated and there is confounding of effect. To remove the confounding, we have to carry out logistic regression. And it was seen that at first birth or second birth after a son and third birth after two sons, there is hardly any difference by regional or socioeconomic factors. At second birth after one daughter, there is relatively higher sex selection in the highest wealth and education group, and relatively less among the Muslims and in the southern region. Sex ratio at birth among Muslims and southern region is relatively better compared to others. And at third birth after two daughters, there is relatively lower sex ratio at highest education and wealth categories, at high media exposure in the western and northern regions, And again, it is relatively less among the Muslims. Now I come to what are perceived values of why sex selection? Obviously, because there is strong son preference. We know it, it is nothing new. It has been known in the field for a long time. Basically, the perceived values of sons are much higher than perceived values of daughters in many societies and especially in India. And we have sufficient evidence on that. Now, there have been a number of field studies by Mary John, which by the Gokhale Institute. There is very good review by Ravinder Kaur and Kapoor. And of course, we have data from the National Family Health Survey and the IHDS, India Human Development. And this showed that the majority of women do expect to live with sons in old age, do expect financial support primarily from sons in old age, not much from. Not many expect to live with daughters. There is higher reliance on sons in Western and Northern regions, again within this. Moreover, most married women do not own a house or land. Despite legal entitlement, they do not inherit parental property by and large. The general practice is to leave it to brothers, surrender rights to parental property. It's a very common practice in India. The situation is slightly better in the southern region, but overall, women do not own. So inheritance still continues in the male line, no matter what is the legal position. Next, please. Next, please. Of course, there have been some changes in attitude. Some of the recent studies by Mary John and others have shown. Now, education is sought for daughters. Daughters are also to be educated. There is some acceptance of living with married daughters. In fact, many times people say that is because sons may not necessarily be reliable. A son may not turn out to be good, may be spoiled. And after all, what is the point in having a son if the son is not going to be good and take care of you? There is some acceptance of daughters performing rituals. But remember, this is only some acceptance, some change, not a large scale. There is still aversion for being a daughter-only family. People don't want a daughter-only family. They want a son. Economics dictates that a family has at least one son and at most one daughter. Not too many daughters, but have at least one son. And given the fertility squeeze, this really means at least one son or at least two sons. There is some shift in readiness to rely on daughters. However, there are disillusionments and there are disregarding sons. So this is broadly what is seen. Essentially, it means that strong son preference continues. Sons continue to provide the lineage. They inherit. People would like to live with them. And therefore, as long as we have this tendency and the facility, legal or illegal, of scan and termination, the sex ratio at birth may continue to remain adverse for some time. Now, the major findings to conclude. First of all, the census-based indirect estimate is the most plausible estimate of all the available estimates. And the SRS estimates need a correction of about 2% for the recent periods. The correction varies somewhat by states, but broadly it is close to 2%. So we need to raise the SRS estimate by about 2%. Since 2000, the SRB in India has ranged between 900 and 930 with no clear trend. Sex selection persists despite legal measures and despite campaigns. Though there have been some improvements, especially in Himachal Pradesh, partly in Punjab, these have not really spread to the rest of the country. There is a clear regional pattern. Northern and western regions have more masculinity at birth. Missing births each year due to prenatal discrimination is about 4,400,000, 380,000, 386,000 and so on. And the geographic pattern seen for prenatal discrimination is not observed for postnatal discrimination. That is more widely pervasive. We do not see a regional pattern. Finally, with this, after 10 years, 15 years, it seems we are more or less at the same place. We have not really progressed much. We have not really gone further. The campaigns have been there, legal measures have been there, but we need to really achieve greater success. The second thing is that last 20 years, it is the prenatal discrimination that has dominated the discourse on this line, whereas in the past, it was excess female mortality that was a prime factor. We can see now that both are important, both are factors, and we should not lose sight of the fact that there continues to be postnatal discrimination in addition to prenatal discrimination, which has emerged over the past 3 or 4 decades. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kulkarni. That report is dense with data. And you have so beautifully explained the essence of what is in the report so that those of us who are not demographers and who are not statisticians can also understand the nuances of what you have communicated so that we can begin to see a little deeper than what the broad rates are. So thank you very much for that. I see that people are beginning to put questions in the chat. Thank you so much for all the congratulatory words. And I'm also seeing a lot of bonhomie. The demographers are very happy to be part of this, and many of Professor Kulkarni's students are there. Professor Bantia is there, who was the first person who brought such limelight to this attention of sex ratio, but also a lot of bonhomie amongst the feminists and the sociologists and the NGO community who have worked on this issue, taking your data and government data into the field and bringing about action. In fact, many of the people who had encouraged and asked UNFPA to begin to work on this issue back in 2001, 2005, are participating in this webinar. We have colleagues like Geeta Sen, like Leela Visaria, who straddles both worlds, in fact. People from the field like Varsha Deshpande, we've got Dhanashri Brahme and Satya, who were in UNFPA and did a lot of the basic work on this. Vimla Ramachandran, who said, UNFPA, you must begin to work on sex ratio. You can't just work on population. So it's very exciting to see everybody come together here today. There's a regrouping in a way that's going on. So thank you so much for giving us that opportunity. Questions are beginning to trickle in, but before we begin to address them, Christoph, a few words from you, please, on your understanding and review of this report.
Thank you, Ina. And hello to everyone. I'm very pleased to be with you, even though I'm talking from Paris. And I'm very excited by this meeting. First of all, I must tell you that I was eagerly awaiting the release of the report. I've been privileged to see a first draft, and I just wanted the report to be out, and now it's with me, you know, printed, and I can quote it, I can use it, I can share it. And why is it so important? You might be surprised to know that, in fact, for demographers, we do need that kind of reports every now and then. And there was no such report on the sex ratio at birth in India. I mean, no report of that density where almost everything is examined, where all the data are confronted, tested. And it is true that India is some kind of statistical jungle, but at the same time, it's a statistical democracy. So you can get data from everywhere. Professor Kulkarni has used no less than 6 different sources. First of all, talking from Europe, I should stress that there is nothing better than civil registration, than pure PACA registration of births, and it's still incomplete in India, but I hope that in the years to come it will improve, and that as in other countries, we could get the sex ratio of births of last year or last month almost instantly. But this is not the case, so that's why we have to bring all this data together, and especially data from the latest National Family and Health Survey, as well as data from SRS. And so we got from Professor Kulkarni's presentation, but as well from his report, which is so rich, again, that I encourage you to download it, print it out, and examine it carefully. But we got the basic things. For instance, we see that there is a stabilization, what demographers would call a plateau. So apparently the sex ratio at birth is not moving. There are some fluctuations. We don't know whether these are actual fluctuations or just measurement issues, but it's around 900, 930 with no change. So it's probably the lowest level for India, and we don't expect the sex ratio at birth to deteriorate any further. Having said that, it might deteriorate among some groups or among some regions, but I'll get to that later on. So another take-home lesson from the report, and that it's not only about sex ratio at birth, which is a very abstract number. It's also about missing female births. So Professor Kulkarni had already estimated numbers like that in the past, but now he's doing it again with a broader database, which is, as I said, made of very different sources. So what we see, and it is very important to stress it once again, is that we have almost twice the number of women missing before birth compared to girls missing after birth due to excess female mortality. And when you see, when you look at the raw numbers of missing female births, you will see that the largest number is actually in some of the larger states, like UP, but also in Maharashtra, in Rajasthan, and in Gujarat. And in a way, Northwest India, like Haryana or Punjab, they account for lower numbers because these are lower, smaller states. And when you look at the number of girls who are missing after birth, then it's a slightly different geography. This is something we worked with my colleague Nandita Saikia, who is among us, and we saw that it's more in north central India, in fact, in poorer states, that you have excess female mortality. This is, of course, bad news, but it's also worrying because we think that these states at some point will move from excess female mortality to prenatal sex selection, like it has happened in Western India, in Maharashtra, or in Punjab in the past. Now, one other thing that is entirely new in that report and is that we have solid estimates of sex ratio at birth by birth order. First birth, second birth, third birth, or all births. Well, this is new for India to have such a robust estimates, believe me, and I was not able to quote any such thing in the past when I had to compare data from India with data from China or from Vietnam or Eastern Europe. And here what we see are different things. First of all, we see that even for the first and second birth, there is a slight percentage of female births which are missing. So already from the first birth, we don't have 950 as our sex ratio at birth, but it's more like 930. So there are already some missing. And same for second birth, but of course, the sex ratio at birth plunges for the third birth. This is when people decide that they haven't had a son, so they will go actively for sex selection. And this is especially true in northern and western India. We don't see that to the same extent in the rest of India. Now, Professor Kulkarni has shown you something which goes even further than birth order, that you take for birth order, like say third birth, and you distinguish between families without son, with a son and with a daughter, or with only sons. And what you see is that, of course, the sex ratio at birth is worst for families without daughters. It comes down at parity 3 to 700. And in North and Western India, it is even close to 550, which means that almost half of the girls are missing at birth. So people are extremely selecting girls in a way that you wouldn't see elsewhere. I mean, elsewhere in the world. It's really, we go for a third birth, we don't have a son, so we are going to do something about it. And we don't see any impact of the regulations. And there are other computations which are more complex, but which help to show the role of regional affiliation or social affiliation. And here I will just stress a couple of points. We've already talked about North and Western India, but we see also that rates are worse for people with higher education, higher income level, for certain social groups. But what does that say? And also, of course, worse in cities than in the countryside. It shows that it is more of an elite phenomenon, which hasn't spread yet to the entire society. So unless we see elite groups, more educated women or people belonging to the richest quintile, unless we see them change their ways and see improved sex ratio at birth, I'm afraid that things will not improve in the near future. And this takes me to the last thing I wanted to discuss. It's about the trends. And here I will share you projections of the sex ratio at birth for India prepared by colleagues. So I will request Satya, maybe if you could share the slide so it is the previous slide, yes. So here you see the sex ratio at birth expressed in male per female birth. So it's the other way around, I'm sorry. And here you can see that we are around at around 110 today, and that there have been fluctuations, and these fluctuations, in fact, have been already described by Professor Kulkarni, and they come basically from SRS and NFHS estimates. But according to this set of Bayesian estimates, the sex ratio at birth will take another 10 to 15 years to decline in India, but there is a decline coming up. So how do they get to this estimate? They use the experience of other countries like South Korea, Singapore, or Georgia, countries which had a jump in the sex ratio at birth in the past, but where birth masculinity has now come back to a normal level. But if you look at the next slide, please, next slide, you can see that the number of missing female births will keep on increasing because they've been missing in the past. They will be still missing in the population. They will be missing, they will be age 10 or age 20, but there will still be a great deficit of girls and women in society. So it's going to have an impact, especially on the marriage market, but on many other social arrangements behind marriage. So this is not only about the current situation. What Professor Kulkarni has shown us is also that the impact will be a long-term impact, and that we need to worry also for the future of the youth, and that another thing that will need to be tackled very soon is what to do with excess men who are now visible in parts of India and who are going to be much more numerous in the future. I will stop at this. I would love to talk longer about estimates and about figures, but I would like to once again commend the work by Professor Kulkarni and the support by the UNFPA team for this excellent report. Thank you.
Thank you, Christophe. And some good news from you where you don't expect a further deterioration, a normalization, but instead a normalization, but of course with the caution that we're going to see the continuation of the missing numbers through the lifetime of these cohorts. With a number of questions in the chat, I'm sure people are very anxious to hear answers to their questions. But before I do that, may I invite Ms. Vidushi Chaturvedi to please say a few words. Vidushi looks after the whole area of gender-biased sex selection from in the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Over to you, Vidushi. Unmute your mic. Vidushi, are you having trouble?
Okay. Yeah, now it's okay. Good morning, everybody.
Okay.
Congratulations, UNFPA team, and good morning, Professor Kulkarni. Thank you. Congratulations for that excellent presentation and trying to make your study more understandable and for people who are not experts, as Ina saying, pointed out, and more understandable to people like me also. What I would like to say is that I think the study, if I may be allowed to say, this is out on the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao Abhiyan, which is, I think, a revolutionary scheme, and it's built a momentum over the years since it was launched in 2015. And I see that the latest SRS does show slight, glimpses of hope, and it shows some improvement as we see that 9 states, 15 states are showing some improvement. Of course, Professor Kulkarni's study is, it does not take, that has just been released, the SRS has just been released. But what I want to put forth is that the efforts made through the BBBP, I think, has brought in some improvement and some containment, Professor Kulkarni, some arresting of figures, and some, that decline has been arrested to some extent. So, well, I am an optimist, and I feel that, like Christopher just now mentioned, that the decline may, may continue, and the dismal picture being painted may, continue in the future also. I would like to say that the vigor and the focus that we are putting in, I feel that we should be able to, lessen the decline, and some preference phenomenon should, to some extent, be lessened, if not eliminated. And without taking much more time, I would like to say that Professor Kulkarni should have included this very social revolutionary movement which has actually caught the imagination of people. And because, it is being espoused by no less than the Prime Minister, Sir himself. So I think, and it has, it is pan-India. It began with 100 districts and today it is pan-India. So it has had some positive impact, and I think we are on the right path. And of course, the results are not anything to celebrate or to be very happy about. But I, as a person who's looking after the PCP and DT Act, would say that, well, we need to put in more vigor and more energy into whatever we are doing, but we are not off track. So that's a glimmer of hope. And Professor Kulkarni, thank you very much for showing us the path and guiding us. And I congratulate you once again. Thank you so much for this very wonderful.
Thank you, Vidushi, for reminding us about the important government programs that are addressing this issue. Not only the BVVP, but many programs that look at education, that look at employment, that look at skilling. Unfortunately, it wasn't the brief to Professor Kulkarni to speak about the multiple interventions. And I see also in the chat that there is a question that why don't we look at an assessment of some of these initiatives and programs, and that may be something to look at in the future. In fact, many, yeah, go ahead, Vidushi.
Thank you, Ina. No, just it may not be the brief, but because it's something which impacts the issue, and it has been conceptualized keeping this issue in mind, the son preference phenomenon. And of course, I'm very happy that this very, very grave issue has been pointed out, and it is our concern. And we are happy that we've got more support in this. And this is something where we need all stakeholders, all people to work together. Only then we can resolve this very, very complex issue.
Fair enough, you're right. And in fact, many recommendations and an exploration of what is possible to address gender bias sex selection have been made in UNFPA's recent Global State of the World Population Report, which looked at issues of harmful practices such as gender bias sex selection and female genital mutilation, as well as child marriage. And Argentina referred to that at the beginning of the meeting. In fact, one of the things that has been put forward there is the 3A's intervention, which is looking at assets that girls and that women own and how asset ownership can be seen as a very strong intervention for changing ratios in the long term. The second is looking at agency, which goes beyond looking at education and skilling, for example, but the ability for girls to be able to live their aspirations and to have the freedoms and space to do so. And the third A is about aging societies and how this change in aging societies with smaller families is going to result in or can result in seeing daughters and sons in a more equitable way, with families becoming more ready to look at daughters as a source of old age support, not just of sons. And we see some of that reflected in what Professor Kulkarni spoke of. Now, there are many, many interventions that can be taken, many interventions that are more effective than others. We have global knowledge, we have knowledge, huge resource base of knowledge in India, and surely that is work that needs to be done. And there's such a richness here that we need to capture. One of the things that is coming up again and again in the question box is about postnatal discrimination. I think in the way that Professor Kulkarni has presented the data and the way that he's done the analysis, everybody is quite taken aback by the extent of postnatal data and the ratios between prenatal discrimination and postnatal discrimination. So I'm going to ask Professor Kulkarni to speak about that as well. And there are a lot of questions for you, Professor, so please be ready with your, I'll ask them to you in 3 different lots. The first set of questions deals with data. Everybody wants to know about the 2% correction. Why is there a 2% correction that is required? And this is an upward or downward correction. Please, could you explain that? So that's one question. People also want to know about NFHS versus SRS data and that reliability. Another question relates to the rural-urban comparison and Tier 1, Tier 2 comparison of SRB. And the other question is about the postnatal discrimination. So leave the postnatal discrimination question for now, but if you could answer these questions on the 2%, urban-rural, Tier 2, Tier 1, and NFHS versus SRB. Thank you. First this round.
May I come in?
Yes, please, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ina, for summarizing the questions, and I could also see. Yes, you're right. Postnatal discrimination is something that we have not been talking about. As we know, the very seminal work done on India by Praveen Visaria in 1960s talked of excess female mortality, and the sex ratio in India was more masculine than natural at the time, and he attributed it with very rigorous analysis, and that was the first major work on sex ratio in India, and that was excess female mortality. But once the prenatal discrimination has become common, we have more or less forgotten about it, though it persists. So my point was simply to draw attention to the fact that that also is there. It may not be as large as prenatal discrimination at the national level, but in many states it is as large as prenatal discrimination. States where sex ratio at birth is near natural, there is postnatal discrimination, excess female mortality, and that is something that needs to be addressed. The rural-urban comparison, of course, when I looked at the data, we generally have feeling urban areas have more of this problem because there is greater access to the facilities, scan, and so on. However, the analysis of the data, especially NFHS, showed that there is no rural-urban difference if we control for other factors. So if we control for education, income, and so on, we really don't see net rural-urban difference. Now, what about this 2% correction, upward or downward? Well, the way I have presented data in this report is female births per 1,000 male births. Globally, it is the other way. Male births per 100 female births. Sticking to this Indian style, the way 2% correction came in was for 2004 to 11, we have census indirect estimates obtained by reverse survival. Now for India, that is 923 girls per 1,000 boys. The SRS estimates for that period, which we really need to combine because SRS gives for 3 years, is approximately 903. So from 903 to 923 is a 2% increase. Now why census indirect estimate is preferred? For that, I looked at the data on omission in census, age misreporting in census, and after looking at that, it was found that for the age group 0 to 6, the sex selective omission in enumeration, misreporting of age, when we combine the age group 0 to 6, is really minimal. And therefore 923 girls per 1,000 boys is broadly acceptable as the estimate for the period 2004-11. SRS estimate is 903. This is a correction of 2% rising upward. If we look at the international way of sex ratio at birth, then it will be 2% downwards. So it depends on how you are using it. It's basically very simple arithmetic. You use this convention or that convention. So that's not an issue. About campaigns and so on, yes, I have not looked at the campaigns because that requires a different approach to see how campaigns are working, which campaigns have worked, which have not worked, how things have worked in Himachal Pradesh. We have seen how things work in Korea, South Korea, and so on. So that is not something that is because that requires a different kind of approach. I have not gone into that. Nor did I get into marriage squeeze. Now, these are some of the disclaimers, so to say, what this report has not done. I mentioned it in the report, but somehow I forgot to mention it while presentation. So these are the issues the report has not gone into. These are important issues, of course, and somebody in some other way should look at this. I think, does that address the questions raised by you, Ina? Oh. Anything left out?
You haven't left anything out, but there are a lot more questions. I haven't given you all of them yet. Another set of questions relates to the why. Sorry, before we get into that, there was one question about crime and gender bias sex selection. I would refer you to Professor Ravinder Kaur's study, which had looked at female deficit and crimes, and she did not find a correlation. So I'm not going to address that question to Professor Kulkarni. Professor Kulkarni, people would like to know what is the reason for discrimination in Kerala, which is such an advanced state. They would like to know about the the conclusions that you have made about data in Muslim populations. They want to know if you looked at age of parents when you did your analysis. And one interesting thought that had been put forward is that could the postnatal discrimination that we are seeing now be a result also of privatization of healthcare, therefore girls not being taken to get health services because they are now more expensive? And why do we see that rates are worse in higher economic classes? So these questions, please.
Okay. Okay, I think I will try to answer to the extent possible. First of all, the issue of why among Muslims the tendency is less, basically because there is a strong opposition to an abortion per se. And obviously sex selection requires abortion. Among the Muslim community, generally there is a strong opposition, and that is something that has been seen at many places. So that is one thing which really prevents couples from going for abortions, and that has prevented the sex ratio at birth from falling low in the community. Now, about higher education and higher income groups, one reason is basically there is greater awareness and there is greater capability. As Christoph had mentioned sometimes, can you do it? Is it capable? So there is greater capability with greater education to have a scan, the tendency to go to scan with an income, the ability to take a scan, ability to go for medical termination of pregnancy. These obviously depends on ability, because government institutions are not likely to provide the medical termination in case of sex selection. So otherwise it is available. And therefore it is, put it other way, it is little more possible. One could say that yes, there is some preference also stronger among the higher education and higher income groups, especially higher income groups. Perhaps the differences are not that clear, not so wide. Yes, any? Okay, all right.
So, we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and there has been an observation that what we're seeing is girls dropping out from schools. There's also, and that this needs to be looked at and studied. This has implications not only for son preference as it impacts sex determination and SRB, but also with regard to child marriage, we're seeing impact of that there as well. There is another observation that if sonography is required for sex determination, then maybe we should thank COVID, because people have not been able to get the sonographies done. With regard to the second point, actually the sex ratio at birth is impacted by three interplay of factors. One is the desire for the smaller family, with sons definitely being part of that family. Second is the misuse of the technology, but underlying all that is the discrimination against girls. So even if access to technology is impacted in a short-term way, the underlying discrimination of girls is not improved. In fact, it is worsened. So I don't think we're going to see any benefits to sex ratio at birth because of the pandemic. In fact, we're going to see some worsening of the situation because the tolerance for daughters and all the kind of support that is required to nurture daughters is not going to be so forthcoming in the months and years to come. Professor Kulkarni,
Yes.
or any of our other panelists would like to say something about the COVID situation. Would you like to say anything, Professor?
I don't know what COVID situation, how COVID situation would impact. One immediate impact of COVID situation would be, since many medical services are not easily available in the situation of COVID, that would also apply to the scan, that would also apply to termination of pregnancy. In which case, the actual termination of pregnancies and impact on sex ratio at birth would be less, as long as the present situation continues where medical services are not easily available. As far as tendency is concerned, I'm not really sure with how it will change the tendency to go for sex selection. But the ability to go for sex selection will be rather limited as long as the present situation continues. I was told there are two issues I did not answer. One was the Kerala issue, that why in Kerala there is post-natal
Professor
discrimination.
Kulkarni, can I just interrupt you
Yes.
one moment, please? Because Mr. Praveen Srivastav needs to leave. If
Yes.
there's anything that he would like to say before leaving, may I invite him to do so? Or perhaps he's already proceeded to another meeting. Okay. I think perhaps he may have proceeded, but would like to, there you are. Excellent, thank you. Would you like to say anything else with regard to the questions, in response to the questions that have been raised, and particularly with regard to COVID?
Well, actually, I don't see any question directed at me. I think most of them are directed to Professor Kulkarni and his wonderful work. But as far as COVID is concerned, yes, it has not only opened up, as I said in the beginning, opened up a lot of opportunities for technology to play a major role, but also in decision making. And what Professor Kulkarni was mentioning about the access to services has been curtailed, has had an impact, and what will it, what will it foretell in terms of times to come? We really don't know. We'll have to wait for the outcomes. So, but it has impacted. Yes, I agree with you, with Professor Kulkarni there. And but what we are not understanding is also impacted the data collection. So a lot of the data that usually flows without the COVID has got impacted, and we are trying to look at the best practices globally in terms of how do we capture the lost data in the last few months. And this will impact your regular reporting systems as well as your surveys. So a lot of this will have to see the impact in the months to come. I mean, it's too early to say.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your having been with us for almost the entire duration of the session. Your presence is very significant for us, and we really value your being here through this time.
Well, thanks a lot, and I'm sorry I have to leave in between.
No, we understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Kulkarni, over to you to finish your report.
Okay.
And to add, and one more thing about the Muslim rate, if you can speak to whether this has to do with abortion per se, or whether it has to do with the socio-economic aspects of.
Yeah, I will respond. Thank you. First of all, there was an issue about Kerala, which I did not answer.
Yeah.
Why is there some discrimination in Kerala? It's difficult to say why, but it is there. The quantum is not large. The postnatal discrimination is seen in almost all the states because female mortality is higher than male mortality, or is higher than what is expected given the male mortality. Christoph Gilmotto and his colleagues' work has shown what is the expected female mortality given the male childhood mortality, and it is slightly higher. So we do have that kind of effect. It's not very large among the various states. The effect is not large. About the effect Muslim community, Geeta Sen had asked the question, and there are some others also, whether income, education, and other factors matter. But actually, the analysis controls for all of these. This is a logistic regression analysis where other factors, income, wealth index, rural-urban residence, these have been included. And what we see is the net effect. And the net effect is there. And so one could say that that is because of generally opposition or reluctance to go for abortion that is there, and not because of poverty or not because of education and so. The details are there in the report. Actually, the report gives the details of the analysis, including the odds ratios and predicted values and so on.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to add, Professor? Because we're not going to come back to you with any more questions. Any final thoughts?
No, I think there are some issues about methodology. The report has an appendix on methodology. Now, it was not possible for me to present the methodology. Actually, it would have distracted attention from many of the issues. But methodology has been provided in details, including the formulas in the appendix, both prenatal discrimination as well as postnatal discrimination, as well as estimation of the number of missing female births. Similarly, the methodology of obtaining the correction factor has also been provided in the report, how we get this correction factor, and that is something that we can see. As I'm glad you are going to put the report on the website, I'm sure you'll be able to see it, and that will clarify many of the doubts or answer many of the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Christoph, a final word from you? You're muted, Christoph.
Yes, sorry.
Any final word?
No, I'm very happy that so many people have attended that meeting. I hope that they will download the report and other reports that they can find on the UNFPA website and go through it and then build on it to devise policy initiatives or further scientific analysis of trends. Thank you. And once again, congratulations to Professor Kulkarni and to the UNFPA team.
Argentina, a word from you?
Really just to appreciate Professor Kulkarni's study and Professor Christoph for coming in to highlight what makes this study so interesting at this particular time, because this is a topic that is not new. What is new here? And he, referred to many areas. I caught, for example, the issue of the report being also giving us the birth order, issues of having some data on the postnatal. I remember when the State of the World Population Report was being prepared, the writers were concerned that they didn't have enough data to make certain claims about the postnatal missing girls, and Professor Kulkarni also touched upon those issues. So it's really just an appreciation for the further light that it sheds upon so many issues, and the fact that normally you would think that this is an economic issue, which it is, but not for the same reasons that usually it will happen among the non-educated, only to find that actually this is almost like the reverse because of what it entails. Managing to know whether it is a girl or a boy, it requires a certain economic capability and access, as Professor Kulkarni. So it's really just to thank the participants who asked such very interesting questions, which probably were not all answered, but we could at UNFPA try to capture those questions and then, continue to work with Professor Kulkarni, and if it also calls upon other experts to try to respond to those questions. And along with the report on our website, it would be interesting to see a further elucidation on the questions that we asked from the report. So with those words, really, it's just thanking all the experts and the participants who made this interaction so important, but also even in the absence of Secretary Parveen, to thank him for co-hosting this release of the study, and Vidush from the Ministry of Health for representing. We know how busy everyone is in that ministry, but for finding time to be here today. Thank you very much. And Ina, is it you going to close, I suppose? Thank you. You're muted, Ina.
Thank you also for the wonderful questions that we've had. I'm sorry we've not been able to address so many of them, but perhaps we'll have some follow-up discussions. One in particular related to the marriage squeeze, not the marriage market. We're not speaking about a marriage market here, but about the marriage squeeze, which is about the statistical principle of people in marriageable ages in each of the genders. And that also, in fact, has been looked at by Professor Ravinder Kaur. If anybody would like to see that study, that India is not going to be impacted by a marriage squeeze in the way that had been expected earlier in this century. So that's also good news. My deepest thanks to Professor Kulkarni for the marvelous work that he's done. Thank you so much to for not only commenting about this report, but also being available for so much collective thinking. So many of the participants have been part of that collective thinking. Thanks to colleagues from government who have been with us. Argentina mentioned Professor Srivastav, Vidushi from the Health Ministry, also Nivedita from the Health Ministry, Nandita from the Health Ministry. And my colleagues from UNFPA, Shobna Boyle and Mr. Sanjay Kumar, who have put together this webinar, as well as colleagues like Dhanashri Brahme and Satyanarayan, who have worked on this issue in the past, and Anuja Gulati and others. So thank you all, and Hemant for his back-end work, Vivek for his back-end work. Thank you all very, very much for joining us. We sign off just 4 minutes over time. And I think we do see a need for having follow-up discussions on this and related aspects of this report. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
It's not the end, as you heard. Stay tuned. Thank you.